My all-time favorite lure is a jig. The good old jig and pig. It catches fish in deep water, it catches fish in shallow water, it catches fish in muddy water, it catches them in clear water. You can mimic just about anything that a bass eats with a jig, and it catches big fish. But the big thing about jigs is that not all jigs on the market are created equal. And if you go down the aisle at your local tackle shop, you're gonna be at times overwhelmed by just the sheer number of jigs that there are. I mean, there's literally hundreds, maybe even thousands at your local tackle shop. And the thing is that no matter what style of jig that you are fishing, whether it's a football jig or an Arky style jig or a ball head jig or a swim jig, there is one big issue that you need to look at. Actually, scratch that. There are two big issues that if you pick up a jig, you need to look at these two things with your jig to make sure that it is going to be a high quality jig. Because if you don't, it's going to cost you money. It's going to cost you fish, which is not good. So let's get into those two issues. Real quick before I do, guys, this video is brought to you by my apparel company, Finn Fishing. I have USA made sun shirts. They're one of the only ones on the market. If you want to help support the channel, click those links down below. All right. Let's talk about the first big issue that you should look at with all your jigs, which is the hook gap. The hook gap is really important on a jig. The bigger your hook gap is, typically the better you're going to hook up with fish. And you might be asking me, Tyler, what is hook gap? And so let me show you. This is actually a grass jig right here. So in order to look at your hook gap, what I want you to do is take your finger and you're going to kind of make it parallel with the hook shank. And then you're going to raise your finger to where the eye of the hook is. So if I go right to the eye of the hook, you can see right there that between the top of my finger and the top of the point of the hook, there's about a ½ inch of clearance there. That is your hook gap. That is what's really important to find on your jigs. You want a jig that has at least some hook gap there. Now, example, let's look at this jig right here. This is an Arky style jig, and as you can see, the eye of this particular hook is really kind of pushed up. It's really kind of up there, right? So again, take my finger, make it parallel to the hook shank, and then raise it to the top of that hook point. And as you can see, the top of that hook, where the top of my finger is to the hook point, there's probably about an 1/8 inch gap there. Now, that's actually not bad. I will take an 1/8 inch gap when it comes to a hook gap. I think that that's still effective. But there are jigs out there in the market. There are some that I have used that have 0 hook gap. When you do this little hook gap measurement, you put your finger right there, your finger will literally be parallel with the hook point. And what that does is it literally acts as like a block to your hook. When you set the hook on a fish, it more or less hits that particular spot, and then it doesn't leave enough gap for the bass to actually get hooked. So not only will you miss fish setting the hook with a jig at times, but also what I've seen is that those fish you'll just lose a lot. If you actually do hook them, they're not really hooked that deep, and you will lose a lot of fish. So no matter what style of jig that you buy, the first thing that I'm gonna look at is my hook gap. Make sure that there's at least probably an 1/8 inch there. That's gonna make sure that you actually hook up and land those fish that bite it. Now, the next thing that you wanna look at is a weed guard. Okay, the weed guard is really, really important. And I'm gonna pull up one of my favorite little jigs right here. This jig right here is a little Kitech casting jig. So first of all, if you look at the hook gap, which we just talked about, there's over an 1/8 inch. Like if I'm doing the exact same thing right here, there's over an 1/8 inch of gap, and this hook is kind of pointed upwards, if you see that. And so that even helps us out a little bit more. The other thing that I just want to talk about is your weed guard. As you can see on this particular jig, the weed guard is very close to the hook point. That is key. You want a weed guard that is fairly close to the hook point. And because this is what allows that bait to come through a lot of cover, and it helps you, again, to hook up with fish a little bit better. This particular jig right here, this is actually the one that has about an 1/8 inch gap on it. look at how much room there is between the hook and the weed guard. Like there's a lot of daylight there, I guess you can say. That is bad for a number of reasons. One, what happens a lot of times is you're bringing this jig through a bunch of cover, and what it does is it wants to roll every now and then. And when it wants to roll, it can actually just roll and it'll hook into that branch or that twig that you're bringing it through fairly easily. And so that's something that we don't necessarily want. We don't want that thing to roll over and get hung, because then you're going to be snapping off a lot of jigs. It's going to be costing you a lot of money. The other thing is when you do have a big hook gap, or a gap between the weed guard and the hook point that's so big, when a fish bites that bait and you set the hook, the further that gap between the hook point and the weed guard is, the more pressure it takes to push this weed guard down. So that means that it's literally fighting you the whole way until you get to that hook point where you actually hook into that fish. You look at the little Kitech casting jig, it does not, first of all, this weed guard's a lot more flimsy, but second of all, it doesn't take much pressure to get to the hook point. So those are the two really big issues that you always want to find with your jigs. So if you guys want to watch my most recent video, you can click right here. Otherwise, I will see you tomorrow.